What happens when we talk about topics that have been hidden? Uncomfortable topics that can cause upset and anger and sadness and often uncertainty. The kind of topics usually unwelcome on Sunday mornings in a lovely church like Mayfair United Church. What happens? Does God want us talking about these things? Really? Reverend Dave, do we have to talk about these tough topics? For too long, God has been seen as the God of the British dinner table, where everyone pretends everything is just going swimmingly well. And no one talks about uncomfortable things. For too long, God has been seen as, the Downton Abbey God. The God of the upstairs people. Definitely not the God of the downstairs people. Does God really want us to talk about the uncomfortable things going on in our world or in our own lives? The answer lies with Jesus. Jesus lived in a way that was itself an uncomfortable conversation. Beyond his own words and parables and sayings, Jesus' actions showed us that God calls us to the uncomfortable conversations so that we might confront injustice, inequality, and oppression. Everywhere Jesus left, tough conversations followed. And so we turn to the story of Bathsheba. I say Bathsheba because for too long it's been called the story of King David. And in fact, that's why it was told. And in fact, the scripture lesson today went on a lot longer. There's more. Psalm 51, all about David crying out confessional words to God. I've sinned. Oh, boo-hoo, David, is what I have to say today. Today, the story is Bathsheba's. She's been treated like a footnote to this story for far too long. It was told about King David and the story that sets up the eventual birth of Solomon, and many, many, many generations later, the eventual birth of Jesus. Jesus is a descendant of Bathsheba. Interestingly enough, the story starts today with the Israelites went out and ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. We could say that that's exactly what David did when he stayed home. It's what he did to Bathsheba. There's ravaging and there's besieging all around. Like happens all too often in the 21st century, many have tried to blame Bathsheba for the problem of this story. Just Google, this is your Google homework from Reverend Dave for today. Go home and Google Bathsheba and hit images. Oh, there are some hot images of Bathsheba. Why? Because it says she was having a bath and she was beautiful. Therefore, somehow, it means she was sexy. And it means she was a seductress. And it means she had, some people have said for centuries, political aspirations. Bathsheba was performing the ritual of mikvah. It's an ancient tradition among Jewish women. 7 days after their period, they would bathe, often in a communal mikvah bath, somewhere central to the city. And wealthy women, I don't know, I didn't read this, but I'm guessing, the wealthier women of Jerusalem may have had private mikvah baths. And Bathsheba, who was daughter of Eliam and wife of Uriah, 2 of the 30, they're called. They're 2 men of the 30, King David's top soldiers, top generals. Maybe she could afford her own mikvah bath, private. We don't know where she was. I kind of realized this week, I always thought she was on a rooftop. No, David was on the rooftop, and it was the highest place in the city, because he was king. And he could see a lot of things. People have even said that she was filled with so much political aspiration that she bathed on purpose in the sight of David. No, if, as a good Jewish woman, she would have figured the king was out to battle. Because that's where he was supposed to be. It says, in the time of war, in the season of war, when kings went out to battle. Except for David. That's the problem. He was where he wasn't supposed to be. He was on a rooftop he wasn't supposed to be on, and he was looking at what he shouldn't have been looking at. Ooh. And there she was. And she wasn't naked. Mikvah doesn't necessarily happen naked. Most likely bound in beautiful ritual cloth for the bath of purification. She was, in fact, doing exactly what God called her to do. She was a respectable woman in a respectable place, doing a respectable thing, the wife of a respectable man, or the daughter of a respectable man. She was doing exactly what God expected. She was following the law, and what God asked of her, David was not. He was doing the opposite of what God had called him to do. He was God's great warrior, brought Israel together, smoked other nations. Don't get to say smoke very often. But he wasn't doing what he's supposed to be doing. He stayed home. Right there, the crisis in the first line of chapter 11. In the time of war, when kings go out with their men, but David was at home in Jerusalem. What, did he have a cough? Look, what was he doing? It was a man cough. Took him right out. The ritual bathing, I realized this week, that Bathsheba performed was the last thing she did of her own free will. Because from that point on, she becomes under the control and the command of her king, the most powerful man in the world. If you watch Gregory Peck and the story of Bathsheba and David, and the woman, the actress was Susan, I want to say Hayward, but I'm wrong. It wasn't a love story, folks. This was a man at the height of his power, sick with power, not where he's supposed to be, taking what he doesn't deserve and should not take. The question we are left with is, does God care about the abuse of Bathsheba? Does God care that she was taken, controlled, abused, turned away, had her husband killed, and then brought back by command into the king's household? Does God care about that sort of stuff? Well, the story says that God, in fact, blames David. God punishes David, not Bathsheba. And David is punished. The prophet Nathan is sent. I love, one writer said this week, Nathan, the nephew of the alarm bell, Samuel. He's the nephew of the great prophet Samuel who anointed David. Now his nephew has taken over. And Nathan comes with a story. Beautiful prophetic imagination. Tells a story about the poor man who has the one lamb. And on that ewe lamb, the whole future of his children rests. Do you know that? When a poor family had one ewe lamb, that lamb was going to grow up and make little lambs. And on those little lambs, the children of that man would have their livelihood. And the rich man next door comes and takes that lamb and kills it for a traveler. Tells the story, David gets into a furious rage. Who is that man? I will get him. And Nathan says, you are that man. And as the same writer said this week, and David became silence itself. You are that man. Nathan rebukes David. Nathan reminds David with this parable that he is a taker. He abused his power and he took Bathsheba and he took Uriah's life. And the verb take or got is all the way through those two chapters. Just go read it sometime and look at everything David takes or gets. He reminds David that it's a significant break with God's ways, because taking is an abuse of power. Many commentaries on this passage mention that David, in fact, broke 3 of the 10 commandments. You want to list them? Coveted his neighbor's wife. Thanks, Cornelia, right off adultery, murder. I'd say there's some lying in there too, and deception around Uriah and the whole drinking bit, but we're going to leave that. 3 of the 10 commandments are broken by the greatest king Israel has ever known. Sadly, what they miss is all the other ungodly action David takes, especially the assault on Bathsheba, on her body and on her whole life. One writer did point out, though, at least, Uriah gets to die. He doesn't have to live with the brokenness of the broken commandments, whereas Bathsheba has to live with the trauma the rest of her life. Now we turn to the spiritual descendants of King David, those of us in the Christian church. And I hardly even have to say it, but you know the Christian church for 2,000 years has been a very popular place for dismissing the hurt and trauma brought to women. From the gender-specific role of ministry to those genderly specific men in those roles of ministry hurting women for centuries, to bishops and moderators and leaders brushing it, whole congregations brushing it under the carpet. Christianity has been King David far too often. Just want to pause here. Men, let's talk to the women first. Women, if any of this is upsetting you, please know that you can sit with me afterwards. Come talk to me during the week. I'm here for that. Men, if you're feeling threatened, let's just pause for a second. If you don't like talking about this stuff, listening to this stuff, I'd like you to take it to God so that you don't stay threatened, but that you learn better how to listen. That's what prayer can help us do. Helps us listen. I had a coffee with David Curtin from the radio station the other day. We were planning something. And, he'd taken on the whole Justice Kavanaugh, Christine Blasey Ford issue in the States. And on his radio show, I said, "Did you take it on?" "Well, of course. It's a radio show. It's talk radio." I said, "What did you do?" He said, "Well, of course, I told the men who called in to shut up. I took a page from you, Dave, and I told them to shut up and listen." If we take our feelings of threat to God, we will learn to listen, and listen we need to do. That sounded like Yoda. Listen, we need to do. We need to listen better. Could not speak about this scripture lesson and preach it in any other way in the context of what we're living in North America in the past couple of years. Not just the Me Too movement, not just Bill Cosby, not just movie moguls, but just the past couple of weeks with the Supreme Court Justice hearings about Dale Kavanaugh and his obscene statements, his infant-like breakdown. Oh, boo-hoo, Judge Kavanaugh. And the powerful courage of Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. How many of you remember her name? The women remember her name. The men call it the Kavanaugh hearings. He wasn't the one on trial. Too many men in our world go unchecked. And by too many, I mean 99.99% of the men in our world who hurt women go unchecked. But David did not go unchecked. So I wonder this morning, in the face of this scripture that speaks so much of our own context today, where is the spirit of Nathan, the prophet, today? As one well-known speaker and writer said, "I'm tired of the word ally. I want men to be traitors. I don't want men to be allies. It's too soft. It's too," well, I agree. She was calling men to be traitors against the machismo the code and the culture that we grew up in as men? Where is the spirit of Nathan? Is it in this church? Is it in another Christian church? The church that's been so complicit in the hurt for so long? In this church, we must very, very, very crucially not become a community of nervousness and coldness. That's what happens when men get blamed for things. We get tight. That's how we got in the problem in the first place. Our tightness, our armor. We can't be that kind of community. Not at Mayfair United Church. We got to drop our armor. We got to open our hearts. We got to listen carefully. And we have to respond responsibly, with accountability, and with compassion. Men of faith, men of the church, need to hold each other accountable when they witness uncomfortable, unsafe interactions with women. And I haven't done a great job, I'll admit. I've watched things go down in the Christian church and been silent. Christian brothers, let me say it very plainly. We do not get to hug anyone we want to hug. We do not get to touch anyone we want to touch. We need to respect personal space. And there are respectful ways to be around each other. But to get to that place, we first must realize and admit that women don't feel safe around men. In fact, there are so many things women do in order to feel safe. And at that meeting I had with David Curtin, he reminded me of this kind of thing that went viral across the internet a number of weeks ago. Maybe it was a year ago. It's been going for a while. Jackson Katz, a sociology professor, sat in his class and asked the men, what do you do each day to avoid being sexually assaulted? Absolute silence from the men. Finally, one courageous young man said, I guess nothing. I never even have to think about it. Okay, Norma. Nothing. I don't think about it. Then he asked the women. There's the list. It actually goes off the slide. I couldn't fit it all on. This is what women do to try and feel safe in the world. Hold their keys as a potential weapon. Always carry a cell phone. Lock the windows when I sleep. Be careful not to drink too much. Make sure I see my drink being poured. Own a big dog. Carry mace and pepper spray. Park in well-lit areas. Don't get on elevators with men if they're alone. Vary your route home from work. Watch what I wear. The list goes on and on and on. In 2001, February, I took supervision training for supervising student ministers. And down at what we used to call PCTC, the Calling Lake Center, it's down at Fort Capel, United Church Center. And it's like it got a couple buildings that were dormitories, and they were just kind of like dormitories with thin walls, like cinder block or something. You could hear people snoring, all that kind of stuff. And it was really cozy. It had the tiny little bathtub that I couldn't fit in. And the food was always good there. And the community was always rich and comfortable. 10 days we lived with each other. 11 nights, 10 full days. We lived with each other and poured our hearts to each other about our own lives so that we are prepared to guide and mentor students and be, stable for them. About midway through the time, we were learning about these kind of issues. And the leader of that session asked the women in the room, and there's about 35 of us, how many of you locked your doors as you slept last night? Every single woman in the circle put their hand up. And I was like 31. I was so young. I couldn't believe it. I never even thought of locking my door. We're all ministry. We're all Christian brothers and sisters, right? We're all living in a nice, cozy little place. PCTC, we're entering a relationship with the spirit community, and all of the women locked their doors to their rooms at night. Wow. That's the state of the world. That's North America. That's the Christian church. But I want you to know, we can do this. I truly believe the church can be a better place, or I wouldn't get up here on my stool. Society can change. The church can change. But first we must lean into the rebuke of Nathan. We must listen for the voice of Nathan and God telling us where we've gone wrong. And it usually comes in the voice of our sisters. We need to not close down, defend, or re-victimize. We need to lean in to the hurtful things we hear. And then we need to pray. And understand that God knows we can be better. May it be so. Amen.